Welcome to The Real and the Woo. I'm your host, Laurie Stern. Join me as I invite experts and friends to discuss a range of topics, from the factual and practical to the mystical and magical. Consider this your virtual happy hour filled with lively, authentic, and meaningful conversations meant to inform, inspire, and ignite your curiosity. Whether you are very real or super woo, this podcast is just for you. Welcome to The Real and the Woo. I am your host, Laurie Stern, and with me today is my friend Annemarie Sampson, who is really kick-ass, actually. I was just doing a little more research on your website, and you have so many tabs, and there's just so many kibbles and bits I want to get into. So I would just like you to tell the listeners in your own words. If you want to go through your tabs, you go right ahead. I know what you do, but I don't want to screw it up. So in any particular order, please give us a little smattering of all the amazing things that you do.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for reaching out and taking all the energy it took to try to get this scheduled. I know both you and I have full schedules, so thanks for sticking with it. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've been in the industry a really long time, so about 38 years. I spent 1 year after I started actually teaching aerobics. I don't even know if anyone remembers what aerobics was.
We connected on that.
Yeah, back in the day.
We talked about our butt floss and our scrunchy socks and
exactly.
The whole
leg warmers.
Midwest mania, getting your certification.
Yeah, with Sarah Cooperman, 100%. Yeah, back in the day.
Back in the day.
Yeah, gymnastics. And I opened Second Wind, which was in the Goose Island corridor. And I knew what I thought was a lot about the fitness industry at the time, knew nothing about business. So as fun and as energetic and as incredible as Second Wind was, it was a business flop. So I had the privilege to be able to go to Lakeshore Athletic Club from there. And that's really where I spent the majority of my career. As anybody in group exercise knows, it is fun and it's energetic. It's a great way to meet people. It's a super tough way to make a living.
Yep. Yep.
So went and got my personal training certification, also went and got my yoga certification, and then a few other specialty things like pre and postnatal. I did do a senior fitness certification. I did do some contract work with the City of Chicago Department of Aging, kind of really able to try a bunch of things on for size, which I'm super grateful for, to be honest with you. I think that was one of the exciting things about the industry back then is it was people who were passionate about the industry trying to have it come to life, right? And so I really appreciate trying a bunch of different things on. As I started getting deeper and deeper into my career, I also started recognizing some of the stumbling blocks in the fitness industry. Some of them frustrated me a lot. Some of them moved me to be where I'm at today, quite frankly. So I have narrowed my focus down. I don't like to say niche because I do focus on girls and women in sport. I believe there's an athlete in all of us. And I don't think that women or females are a quote unquote niche market because we make up 50% of the population. So that's not really a niche, right? So that's kind of where I've landed. I do within my business. So my organization or my company is called sustainablelife.live. And within that, I have two focuses. One is Swell, which is She's Well, and the other is Peak. So it's PEAC, Performance Education for Athletes and Coaches. And the hashtag or the acronym there is not the acronym, the hashtag is Train Like a Girl. So that's really focused more on girls in sport. And again, people, I think, looked at that at first and they thought that's a really huge demographic. But when I look at some of the pitfalls when it comes to, in particular, what has happened to women from a cultural bias and a cultural standard perspective. A lot of the misinformation in the fitness and nutrition industries at an early age leads to ongoing issues with women as they start to mature, issues with, irregular periods or lack of period, issues with multiple stress fractures, which is something that I suffered with, infertility, which is something I suffered with, malnutrition, which doesn't always look like what people think it looks like, issues with osteopenia and osteosporosis at a super young age, again, just because of lack of nutrition. Some of that is lack of access. Some of that is just bad information. And I just had a really awesome conversation with a sports nutritionist, Heidi Stickler, and she points out that middle school and high school athletes are some of the most unintentionally underfueled people on the planet, mostly because of their schedule. They're up early, they're on the go at school, they don't necessarily have time to eat, they're at practice after school, they're on the go. And just the information around, what do we need from a fuel perspective to function and to flourish, as opposed to the opposite messaging, which I think is prevalent in our industry, is what do you need to fuel like to quote unquote look a certain way? So kind of moving away from some of that conversation, a lot of intentionality around words, a lot of intentionality around conversations, but also the ability to stay curious and open. So kind of a long-winded story, but I think it got you to where you wanted to go.
Yes, there's so much in there. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for all you're doing. You and I know each other. And my story is similar in that I was a dancer and an athlete, went down the aerobics road and started teaching aerobics and things like that. And my husband and I share 4 children who are all athletes as well, 2 who went to college for their sport, and one with whom we connect. She's a female athlete. And I want to go back to, you were just saying intentionality in terms of words and conversation. Would you like to elaborate on some of that just a little bit? And because in my mind, I know where I go in terms of, we've got good coaches and we've got coaches that suck. And that's for any gender, right? We know, sure. I was saying this the other day, we leave our kids on these fields in the hands of these people. Sometimes they see them more than they see us. And we have faith and trust that those people know, just like you said about nutrition. I love your website also discusses recovery, which is so huge, the mindfulness part of it. So I didn't know if you incorporate yoga into some of those pieces for your female athletes about when they do eat. Are they eating mindfully? It's, of course, good nutrition, but are they stuffing their face because now they have to get their homework done? So what kinds of intentional words, I guess, are your secret sauce, and kinds of conversations you're having that change the paradigm? I know you and I grew up with, Title IX and all that stuff, and we're watching this shift. My college athletic daughter just graduated, and now those athletes can make money on themselves, which I think is a good thing and a bad thing. But we're watching this wave that we've been slowly trying to push along ourselves, of course, and it can't happen fast enough, in our opinion. So in those ways, like, how are you trying to shift the paradigm and, with your words and conversation? Yeah.
So some of the things we do, and we talk about this, I talked about it at a parent meeting. I talk about it. We did an activity yesterday. We were indoors because of the heat wave here, so we can't practice outdoors in the afternoon. And we did an activity that was a switch, a mind switch, like, a reframe. And so here's an example: to say to somebody, you are fit, as opposed to you look fit. So what we're trying not to do is, we're not saying to athletes, you look fit, because we don't know what fitness looks like. I mean, you look at a para-Olympic athlete, you look at a weight lifter in the Olympics, and then you look at a gymnast. Who's to say one looks fit and the other doesn't look fit? They're all fit, but it's not a look. So fitness isn't a look. So we're trying to use, that's a super small but really impactful change. You are 100%. Fit as opposed to you look fit. Another one is, and again, I don't think a lot of people are walking around saying this, but, I get comments all the time. And when I was coming up in the industry, I worked a lot with men because at the time, and I know you and I talked about this, men were the ones with the time and the money. So I mostly saw male clients. And the number of them that called me legs, 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 they called me legs. They commented on my legs all the time. And when I would comment on that, not usually to them, but usually to people I worked with, they're like, it's a compliment. Like, look at your legs. And I'm like, it made me so cringy and so uncomfortable. Those were the same people when I was growing up that were called thunder thighs. Like, look at those thunder thighs, but even a switch of something, instead of saying, calling someone legs or drawing attention to their legs, like, oh my gosh, how powerful and strong is your lower body to carry you across all those miles? Or how strong and powerful is that lower body that allows you to jump, to a basketball hoop? So that's something that's a super simple change. Conversations around food being quote unquote healthy or unhealthy or quote unquote clean or unclean. It's not that we shouldn't be having conversations, in particular with our children who are in our home, about things that we think are going to fuel them for success, because I think that's our responsibility. But I think the responsibility as a coach to have conversations around access, affordability, the function of food. So using words like festive, fun, flavorful, hydrating. We talked a lot about hydrating this time of year, especially it's 100 degrees outside. And foods that are super hydrating is, like watermelons and melons and strawberries and popsicles and things like that are great ways to get hydration and electrolytes and, simple sugars that break down for cross-country runners into their nutrition plan. So just changing language around that. We're not saying that an athlete should eat a popsicle 3 meals a day and plus 2 snacks. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that when it's 100 degrees out, it's a really good option for somebody who's running, 5 or 6 or 7 miles a day. It's a great option. It's a great way to get liquids in and to get simple sugars in. And so some of that, even conversations around fuel, like demonized foods, when you're running cross country, carbohydrates and sugars are our friends. They really are. And our athletes talk about that because we have some really high functioning athletes, and they are not only exceptional cross-country runners, they're also exceptional soccer players or basketball players or softball players. And they'll flat out tell you the energy required to run cross-country isn't the same to go to basketball practice. And it's certainly not the same to go to softball practice.
Yeah.
So we are encouraging our kids to have foods that are easily broken down, gels and applesauce, squeezes and, bananas and rice cakes and bagels and those type of things, because they're important for the sport. And I think that those are some of the things that are really misunderstood, because things like wellness, fitness, nutrition have been really oversimplified.
I wanted to connect with the legs because my whole life, I was a ballet dancer for years and years. And so starting in junior high and through high school, my nickname was Flex. My maiden name's Fleischman, but my nickname was Flex. And because I have really defined calves, and I have siblings who have the same legs. And I recognize no matter what their size might be, because we're all different sizes, we're built in a very muscular way. Yeah. And it really made me proud, depending on who was saying it, or cringy and awful about myself, depending on who was saying it, because you can tell a tone in their voice.
Right.
And of course, as high school reunions came up and things like that, and I, developed and stayed in this industry, I recognized the thing that people might have made fun of me about are the very thing that they're like, wow, you're still, staying fit, right? It's because I look fit. But it sort of has made me say like, oh, who's laughing now kind of thing, which is not kind. And that, was where I was from time to time. And now it's just like, I am who I am. I'm built how I am. Genetics plays a huge role in how I'm built.
Completely.
And I don't think people really understand that. So I'll never be what I call the pinky size woman, where they can walk into a jean store and literally wear like a size 000. And I remember when my girls especially started, going to junior high and comparing themselves as people do, I would always say, measure your wrist. Look how your wrist is. your wrist is bigger than that other person.
Right.
You're never going to be that size. So let's just rock the size we are, the way we're shaped, and recognize some people truly have bigger bones or genetically are made to be muscular or not.
Yes.
And even like Oprah, whatever diet and exercise regime she's had her whole life, at the point she was really just exercising and not promoting some crazy diet. I remember her saying, I'm this size, but I'm in good cardiovascular shape.
Right.
Which is so important, right? So it's like you can be all shapes and sizes and be eating really healthy foods and look one way, and the same person with the same regime might look a different way. And I love that you're trying to get away from you look fit versus you are fit. That is just such a huge, and it also goes hand in hand with, I feel like, gender identity now too. It's
100%.
You look like a male or you look like a female versus you're a person, you're a human athlete.
Yeah.
And so I love that you're changing that paradigm. I wanted to ask you too. So we talked about recovery, you mentioned healthy habits, and you also mentioned boundaries. So can you elaborate on that, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah. And I think that boundaries are something, I don't think you and I grew up with, like, no one talked about boundaries, right? Like we were, I grew up in a home where the adults were the adults and the children were children. And that's kind of the way that it was. But even from a social emotional perspective, I definitely grew up in a, patriarchal, male dominated, these are the men, this is what men do. This is what women do. This is what girls do. This is what boys do. And I think some of that was generational, right? And some of that just may have been where I grew up. And I was never able to share my voice or share my story. And I've just gotten really clear boundaries around not only people I choose to spend my time with, but there are situations, even at work where you're working with people and that you're probably never going to be on the same page. And I'm able to set now both personal and professional boundaries that allow me to, interact and stay curious and stay open, but also recognize that no matter what your position is, I'm not required to change my mind, right? I'm not required to do that. And that's one of the things I try to work with even our student athletes, is that this is a reciprocal relationship. If you're allowed to have boundaries, then I'm also allowed to have boundaries. So here's an example. One of the things that I ask is, if something happens and you're upset about it, you're perfectly, like, you should go home, you should talk about it, you should have your moment, you should write a bunch of emails or do whatever. And then you need to pause. You don't send that email, and don't carry on the conversation, with a couple trusted people. Think, pause, reflect, and then come back and, have an open and honest conversation about it. Because I think so much gets lost in translation through email or through text. I think sometimes, situations can be resolved through kind and open and curious conversation. And that's just one thing I've seen go wrong a lot, particularly when you're talking about large groups, is when you go home and something impacted you and you want to regurgitate it and get it out. I understand that. That's my personality too. But the biggest thing for me was learning to not hit send, right? But just to hit delete and reflect and pause. So I think that's kind of what I'm talking about with boundaries, is that we need boundaries to not only protect ourselves emotionally and socially, professionally, but we also need boundaries to help communication stay clear. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I was thinking you were going to also go towards, for example, in an athlete's life, pulled by so many things. They've got their schoolwork, they have their team, they have their family, and training them to also have boundaries of, well, I'm not going to go to that party because I have my homework or I have practice. And, across the board. And I know growing up, we all get pulled in those directions, but to
Sure.
give people, I wish I had those conversations growing up. I was I lived in a community in St. Louis, and in fourth grade, they just allowed girls to play baseball, and they didn't have any girls teams, zero. I was one of three girls in my whole community that tried out and made a baseball team. And because it was fourth grade, we played something called mini ball. So it was, bigger than a hard ball, but smaller than a softball.
Sure.
And I'm still friends with some of these guys, and I still have the picture. It's on my Facebook page. I love it. And, it's like these guys and then me with these long braids. And, I couldn't throw to save my life.
Sure.
But I could hit and I could run. And they stuck me, of course, out in right field, because that's what you do with a girl. You put her out in right field, right? Assholes. So, but my first time up at bat, I hit a triple.
Hilarious.
And the only reason I didn't make it home is because my helmet was too big. So I ran around the bases holding this hard hat on my head.
Right.
Made it to third base, and I was so happy. And it was like, I looked at people and they were like, where did she come from? Half of them were like, good for her. And half of them were like, get that girl off the team kind of thing.
Sure.
And it was just such a strange pocket of time. But the boundary to have people talk to me the way I deserve to be spoken to.
Yeah.
Where you and I connected too is like my work with chakras, and especially with athletes, is if you don't know how to speak up for yourself, then not only do you lose that opportunity, but what you hear other people say doesn't resonate correctly either.
Yeah.
So those kinds of conversations is how to train athletes to have those boundaries, that they have every right to speak and every right to feel like they need a rest or they want to push or whatever.
Yes.
So it's all connected. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of the interesting things, because I think that, when we're talking about boundaries around, social emotional space, we have at Peak, we've got 3 acronyms. So one is FIT, which is female integrated training. One is EAT, which is eat, appetite, and timing. And the other is REST, which is recover, enrich, sleep, and technology. So the enrich part, and we talk a lot about that. Like, one of the things I'm super proud of is I know a lot about, what my clients and what my athletes are doing outside of sport, their love for band, or they're good, photographers, or they've, created, some beautiful art, or they love going to movies with their friends. So that enrich part, so they're not identified, quote unquote, as athlete, the same way they're not identified as girl, or, and some of that I know has gotten super complex, and it's something I want to recognize that. Like, I don't have it all figured out. I do sometimes struggle. I say a lot like, hey girls, or, hey guys, like I use a lot of that type of thing. And I know that there's probably a better way to do that. But the enrich part, where you do recognize who people are outside of, a straight A student at, so-and-so high school that just went to the state tournament in tennis or whatever it is. And sometimes, the enrich part is, they like to sit at home on the weekends and bake chocolate chip cookies with their grandma. I mean, so just kind of understanding who they are outside of these quote unquote expectations. And listen, some of them are societal expectations or parental expectations. Some of them are their own expectations, right? Like, I think that we all, and certainly kids today, have very high expectations of themselves, but understanding that, first of all, life isn't this linear, progression. It's this ebb and flow, which I think is super helpful with yoga. And also that there's plenty of time, particularly when you're looking for girls in sport. We know now, because of science, girls peak at a much later age. So if the best part of your athletic journey was in high school, that's a disservice on my part. I didn't do my job, because you shouldn't be peaking as a runner until your late 20s or your 30s. Like, you've got a long road ahead of you. And I think that the Olympics really showed that off super well this year. Like, even Simone Biles being in her late 20s, and these runners that they've got babies, like, and
34-year-olds. Like, oh my God.
This is what I'm saying.
But
that's a rethink. And we've gotten that wrong in this industry. We've gotten that wrong. And what
I
we
agree.
know is that if we push these kids too soon, too hard, they are going to break.
Mm-hmm.
They are. They're going to break.
Yeah.
Because they got a long road ahead of them.
Well, and you had mentioned that about, stress injuries and stress fractures. Even when I was teaching aerobics, I'm sure you can relate too. I would know I would need new shoes if I got shin splints. It's like, your body starts to tell you things, and obviously big markers, especially for female athletes, if they lose their period or all that's a big marker. But the more subtle things, the small little aches and pains, and how to really, like you said, recover and allow yourself to do that. And then all the pressure that gets placed on these athletes, especially, and just students in general. Really like how you're trying to help them also re-identify, because I talk about this just in my work with clients as well, and classes, of course, is how do we label ourselves and what are we wearing? And when we really get to the nuts and bolts, we're just this human, this divine human that happens to be an athlete, that happens to be a baker, that happens to love band. And why we make anyone pick a lane and stay in it is, I think, a lot of where the pain and it comes up in mental stuff, it comes up in body stuff. It's just to let them know they're allowed to be multifaceted is amazing in the work that you're doing. So thank you for that. And now it's time for Joy on the Five. So, Annemarie, I asked you to do a little homework before we met. I've changed this up in my podcast from time to time. I spring it on people or I prepare people. And so I had asked you to set an alarm and pause when it went off and see what was bringing you joy. And so do you want to talk about how many moments that you had for that, or, just tell me about that?
I had two. And first one was music. So I had some great music playing. And so that was super fun. I don't listen to music while I'm working, which is interesting. So I was really kind of just like fiddling around the house and kind of doing a couple things. And the next one was responding to some student athlete emails. So that were thoughtfully and kindly written. And, it's always a pleasure for me to be able to take the time to respond back in a hopefully kind and articulate way.
You build healthy habits, things take practice. And when we really leave room and cultivate moments to feel joyful, my hope is that people just have more of it, right? Without thinking it's a luxury.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Yeah, that's something that is, we didn't really talk a lot about yoga, but I know you and I connected also because of that piece, but what you do from a more spiritual practice with yoga and your intentionality with everything that you do, it shines through so authentically. And so I'm super grateful to know you because of that. And so that was really sweet. Yeah. So that was awesome.
That's so nice. Well, this is the real and the woo, and we're talking about so many real topics, and spirituality it's not just woo, right? People think it's so out there, and really it's right here. And it just is as simple as pausing and setting an alarm for yourself and saying, where am I happy? Where am I feeling joy? And just really practicing that. And so I love that you have this huge combination as well of life experience, obviously. And, we connected on that as well. But how you share that experience in a really authentic and accessible way, obviously, is what makes you an amazing coach. And I know you also have this whole other offshoot also. You've got your hands and mind and helpfulness on the female athletes, but you also help women of a certain age navigating menopause. And so that's the swell part of your brand as well.
That's the swell part. Yeah.
Do you want to sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And again, I think that's kind of a misunderstood piece, right? And I don't know about you, but no one told me about menopause. That just wasn't the culture that I grew up. I don't even think anyone talked to me about my period. And it just wasn't something that was talked about in our home. And I think that when menopause was coming upon me, I knew that, I was going to lose my period, but that's kind of all I think I knew. Right. And I consider myself pretty fortunate that I didn't have a lot of the symptoms that I think a lot of people suffer with menopause. And I think people attributed that to an overall lifestyle. And I'm not really sure that's the case. I think there's some things, particularly with endocrine disruptors, that can potentially impact some of that. But I think in general, and you and I were kind of talking about this, genetics and biology play a huge role in that. And so I think I got a little lucky there. But what I realized is I was very uneducated when it came to that. So one of the things I think you and I share in common is that I'm a learner, not a knower. And I knew that as I was getting older, my clients were getting older, and I studied pre and postnatal and I studied senior fitness. But there was this whole world, right? There was this whole world from 40 to 80 that's 40 years. It's a long time that nobody was talking about. And so there's so many incredible resources and opportunities out there. Dr. Stacy Sims does an incredible job. I think she's super well educated. She is passionate about talking about women going through menopause. So she's been a great resource. There's Feisty Menopause is another organization out there. They do a really good job. I did go through their certification program, which was really helpful. And since then, I've been able to connect with, beautiful people like Christine Yu, who's an incredible author who wrote Up to Speed. I've been able to talk with her and interview her and kind of dive into some of her resources. And what I'm realizing is while there's not a ton of information out there on women and menopause, there's enough good information out there that any of us can get started. I think one of the hard parts is there's still a big disconnect between what OBGYNs understand and know and GPs understand and know and what the actual science is. That is a little frustrating to me. But again, instead of kind of getting caught in the weeds and the frustration, what I did is I took the information that I knew to be accurate. And by the way, that information may change in 5 years because science is always evolving. But right now it's accurate. It's, meta, verified. So there's there's several analysis on this. Somebody else has done that compounding for me. That's not my jam. But able to synthesize through that and put it together in, thank you for saying that, what I hope is a digestible way so people can take away what it is they need and then leave the rest on the table. So, I believe now at 61, I was just talking to the young woman who cuts my hair, who's pregnant for the first time. And she was talking about how uncomfortable she is with her breasts and she's wearing a jog bra. And I said, the one thing that has really continued to bother me through menopause is my breasts changed and they're just more clunky than they used to be and doesn't really kind of work with what I do. So I also wear a sports bra a lot of the time. And, that's something I wish that would change, but I don't know how I would change that, right? Like unless I had surgery. And, if I look at my family, biology and genes and I look around me, I pretty much know where it came from.
Right.
So I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but I think what I really do hope women, I hope they take the time to learn and stop listening to the stuff that's out there. Like there's so much BS out there, I think is what irritates me.
Well, what I think I hear you saying too is, this portion of your website has information, right? You've got programming for sure, but you and I also connect on this. My whole reason for doing what I'm doing with this podcast, with my website, is to connect dots. So you just mentioned several people's names, with whom you resonate or you respect for their information. And, you're very clear about, I learned this from that person or this from that person. And then people come to you for information to a point. And then you're like, okay, I can put you on a path now to meet this other person that's going to help you with this. And that's what I do. It's like, what I hope people listening to this podcast will do is find you and take a look at your website and take a look at the programs that you have. I know I've talked about collaborating someday with you, whether it's menopause, whether it's female athletes. I know it's going to happen at some point, but you and I together know so many people. My friend Pam knows about osteopenia, and her whole thing is bone health. And boy, if you can get someone like her to talk to female athletes, because you mentioned, that their intense training sets them up, unfortunately, not in all cases, for problems with their bones later on, which seems so antithetical, because what are we taught? When you pound your body, you're building bone strength, right? And yet the way you're feeding your body or not impacts your bones health. So having those experts at a younger age too, and that's all I'm trying to do is just, hey, I don't know everything and I don't have to. That's why you're here. That's why other people do what they do. And if I can say, hey, I'm not your person right now, but I know 3 people who might be, let me help you find that person. I don't have to get a kickback at all. Although now there's people out there like, well, you should absolutely get a kickback and they should pay you for that. It's like, yeah, maybe someday, but my whole purpose is not that. It is really just conversations, information, and elevation and support, especially for kick-ass females doing their thing like you. So I want to thank you for being here. And I want you to please tell everybody how they can find you. And if you have any events coming up or anything else that you'd like to share.
Yeah. So thank you so much. So you can find me on my website, sustainablelife.live. That's also one of my Instagram handles. And I'm also on Instagram at capital PEAC train like a girl. So peak, train like a girl. That's actually run by interns. So I'm not sure people realize that, but a big portion of what I do is being managed and run by right now 3 female interns that have all been both high school and collegiate athletes. So that's been super fun. And that was intentional. First of all, like technology still continues to be a struggle for me. But the other thing is that I want to keep a pulse on the conversation to what people want to hear and what they want to know about. So that site itself is completely run by an intern. I'm obviously on LinkedIn. I shouldn't say obviously, but I'm on LinkedIn, and all of my credentials and certifications and everything is pretty up to date there. As far as events go, I have a couple events with Girl Scouts. I've been really lucky to be connected to some Girl Scout troops. And so I get to go talk to them, which is awesome. But this time of year, I really try to focus on my clients and focus on my student athletes. And that takes up a big chunk of my time through mid to end November.
Yeah. So whenever this airs, you'll still be in the thick of your season, whatever that might be. Yeah. And so people will be able to find you anytime they listen to this show, of course. And I'm so glad that I found you. And I'm so glad that we connect on so many levels. And I really appreciate you spending the time with me today, because I know, like you said, you're a woman in motion.
As are you.
May we both continue being in motion. And I just want to thank you again so much.
Thank you. Have an awesome day.